To kick off the comparative and collaborative session, it's important to situate this thinking on comparative research within a wider set of intellectual and conceptual debates that are taking place, both in Africa, but also in the global South at large. The post-colonial and southern urban southern urban critiques call for centering the diversity of African urban experience. This means that we really want to think about how our individual country, contextual, regional experiences can speak into global policy, into global theory, and into global practice. African cities are increasingly being seen not just as the recipients of global research and policy agendas, but in fact as places where we want to produce these insights from. As Garth Myers points out in his work on comparative African urbanism, he talks about African cities being unusual suspects of urban comparison. This is because often the kind of comparative impulse has leaned towards big global cities, Paris, Shanghai, with sort of some of the smaller cities thinking even about Cape Town or Kisumu, Dar es Salaam as being on the periphery. So this thinking that's come from a lot of the post-colonial scholarship has really infused into some of the global research networks that are in operation. And they have responded to this push asking for large research projects that are comparative in nature, collaborative in nature, and often have a combination between conceptual and policy implications. Since most of this funding for big urban research projects, in fact, sits in the global north, this does require a lot of collaborative efforts. It means that we need to build collaborations between the global south colleagues, as well as between global south colleagues and global north funders. The idea of this session is to really consider how we will build our skills capacity to engage in sort of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and co-production collaborations across urban contexts. One of the important things to consider here is that collaboration also requires developing rich understanding of our own city context. Comparative research, Ben, really does mean that we have to think from places and richly from places, but be able to move these ideas and the people who are thinking them across different contexts. Also, it's important to note that with COVID, this probably means there'll be less movement of people and more movement of ideas and more digital platforms and conversations, which means we really have to build trusting relationships between colleagues in different cities and our ability to share these ideas virtually. One of the things that I think it's really important to understand when we think about the comparative and collaborative research is that we need to make sure that the African colleagues and Southern researchers are not relegated to data collectors for Global North projects, but are in fact core to developing the methodologies and questions that we want to ask. And we just want to say a few words about the different types of comparison. And this is coming from Jenny Robinson's work, who has written extensively on what it means to think from ordinary, everyday Southern contexts and to infuse those discussions into multi-city conversations. And what she says is that we need to move from trying to control difference through comparison. So move away from trying to think about how are places different and let's try to minimize their differences so that we can compare them, into embracing variation. She also talks about the difference between genetic and generative comparison, arguing that genetic comparison is about tracing interconnected genesises, how things have come into being, processes of production, and that lead to repeat instances. This, she contrasts with generative comparison, where variations across places are supported by looking for multiple and serial incidents. And these are then used to engage with theoretical conceptualizations, for example, around informality or governmentality. So let me stop sharing my screen to give the floor to Omar.
Thanks again for the opportunity. As Liza has introduced the work, I just want to say in the beginning, I am not an academic. I am part of an independent research and platform based in Cairo called Cluster. And we're part of the AURI network, and I've been heavily involved in this research over the past 3 years. What I would like to share with you today are two projects. One is comparative approach between 3 cities in Egypt. Then out of that research, we produced a framework that we proposed to AURI to extend to other cities in Africa. 4 cities in Africa, that's Cairo, Dar es Salaam, Lusaka, and Ouagadougou. All right, so basically the research was trying to answer 3 questions. A, how to challenge this conception of cities divided between 2 entities, 2 conditions, the former each being discrete and homogeneous, etc. To challenge that, offer alternative. Secondly, to promote a more integrated urban policy, so that's more kind of policy-oriented approach. And thirdly, which is mostly academic, is to promote a research methodology that could be extended to other cities. So that was the reason. So the first part is introducing the hypothesis and the methodology, etc. And then we look at each of the 3 cities I'm going to introduce. And then the final part is what are the outcome and lessons learned. So basically, we started out by looking at the question of urban informality in many cities, the global south, but focusing mostly on African cities. And you can see the diversity in terms of features and conditions. I just want to say that this research is heavily involved in the spatial manifestation of informality. So we're not looking at economic informality as much, or policy, but mostly the spatial manifestation of informal conditions in cities. But of course, we looked at statistics, examples of the percentage of informality and informal. This is just to tell you, like, this juxtaposition between the formal and informal is something you see in many cities in global south. Sometimes dramatized, and in this case, sometimes it's less conspicuous. But the integrated between the formal and informal is something that we really were interested to explore and to deconstruct this boundary and try to understand what are the interrelationship and the interconnections between the seemingly separate formal and informal entities. So we started by 3 cities in Egypt, so Cairo being the capital and largest city, around 20 million, Alexandria, second largest support city, around 7 million, and Minya is a provincial capital in the south, on the Nile. Pattern here, you can see here a 30-year difference map. We also look at the evolution of state response to informal urbanism over 4 decades or 5 decades in Egypt, and the sort of political pivotal moments and the shift from being, a condition that was ignored and dismissed, then it was confronted, something to be removed, associated with fundamentalism, and then integration policy and upgrading, etc. And also we looked at the different definitions of informal urbanism from a legal perspective and also from safety, like we call it safe and unsafe. Of course, these definitions are state definitions and have legal implication, and so it justifies demolition and relocation under the guise of being unsafe, etc. And we adopted a 3-tier definition based on the origin, the genesis, how they started, the land ownership pattern, and the safety condition. The research methodology is basically going back to the scale question. So we have 3 cities. We looked at 3 scales: a city scale, the overall sort of condition and trajectory, then a district scale, a neighborhood scale, and you can see the distinction between the 2 neighborhoods, and then the node scale, and I'm going to elaborate on that, which is the crossing or the border and the crossing. And then we looked at 3 themes or parameters or variables: the borders, the crossing across these borders, the activities around these crossings, and the flows between the 2 sides. We're talking about capital, goods, and labor flows. And then we adopted a very elaborate visualization technique to abstract the complexity of this variable in terms of crossings and borders. So we developed this being an architect, so we're very interested in finding visual representation. So basically we have 3 cities on 3 scales over 4 variables. So we have this kind of 3D matrix that allows us to deconstruct and undo this complex condition in the 3 cities using this tool. So this is the toolkit that we approach. After that, we started visiting each city, but here is an example of a city, the blue being the formal official definition of planned district, and the orange being the officially designated as unplanned district. And so we took example from the south and the east and the west and northern districts and looked at typical section across this divide on different scales. You can see the different scale from the city, the neighborhood, and the border. And then we also looked in one example, for example, along one border, the multiple crossings and what happened across each. We look in depth in one of these crossings, and then we also further analyze it in terms of activities and flows, as I just mentioned. This is an example. Alexandria, with the same, is a linear city. So you can see the development is linear parallel to the waterfront, and the formal are more or less closer to the waterfront, more high-end development, informal being at the south, of course, divided by infrastructure, railways, etc. Again, just quickly showing a similar methodology, different city. Again, multiple crossings. Okay, so having looked at these three cities, we started to look at them comparatively in terms of basic data, their size, their density, the percentage of formality. Then we started to look at this, typologies of borders and crossing across three cities and try to understand, generate out of these patterns larger economic and policy related questions, like why there's a railway here, why the water canal was filled up to allow to construct a new automobile highway. By understanding what happened around these hubs, you're able to understand also what's coming through from each side in terms of labor going to work on one side of the city, or goods and services being provided to the other side, or transportation hub being interchanged along this crossing. So the second goal is to look at ways through projects or policies to integrate them. And we look at some current examples of, for example, empty plot at the borderline that are being proposed as a park to integrate or promote integration, interconnected it by promoting the lateral connection as opposed to vertical one. And thirdly, to use this methodology that I will show you in the second part of my presentation, looking at these four other cities, Cairo and three other cities. So one thing, we came out of this analysis of this research by two main tools that we took and introduced to the cross-Africa comparison. The one was this urban journey. So instead of looking at the formal and informal as two entities, we took one journey as somebody taking a tuk-tuk, for example, from his or her, where they live, and then going to the city center. And in doing so, they transfer from the tuk-tuk to the microbus, taking the steps to the highway, and the microbus taking it to the next metro station, which would take to the city center. So looking at the urban journey or the urban narrative to emphasize the continuum or the spectrum, looking at the formal interface as a spectrum, a continuum, as opposed to a black and white condition border one single line. So here is sort of a quick storyboards of this journey from a person living in an informal area in the left, and then using this multiple modes of transportation to go to the city center. So we experimented with this animation technique to open up this discourse to a wider public, not only experts.
واستجاح 500.
جنيه.
يلا
شوكولاتة محشية، شوكولاتة بالفندق، شوكولاتة باللون، بيدينا ده ب5 جنيه. ده الطريقة. عالي بقى بالشوكولاتة.
As you move from one end to the other, there's a certain percentage of formality and informality in each mode of transportation and each transition. So it's not 100% informal at one end and 100%. So to be able to substantiate that claim, we started to look at certain variables in each of one of these three modes, which are actors, economy, and structure, and trying to understand how are they manifest spatially and try to quantify this percentage. So for example, in the tuk-tuk, there are certain indicators of informality. For example, the driver is not registered, the tickets are negotiated, there's no sort of almost traffic regulation, but the gasoline is bought from a formal gas station. In the microbus, it gets more balanced. So there's more license plate, there are quasi bus stops regulated, half regulated, but still the fare is not fixed, and etc. And then when you get to the metro, it's almost mostly in the formal side, but you can still find people selling informal vendors in the station, some advertising, etc. So we look at these variables to try to quantify and demonstrate the percent of informality and formality across this cross section of the city, this journey, and we presented it along this diagram to the right to show you the gradual transition from the formal informal, as opposed to the clear cut. It is much more nuanced and complex as this quantifier. So we used this methodology and started a project with three other institutions in Dar es Salaam, Lusaka, and Ouagadougou. And through three hands-on workshops, we started to look at the question of infrastructure in Dar es Salaam. This is an example of a question of water infrastructure, and how are the water being distributed by the municipality or by informal vendors. And we started to do these diagrams. In Lusaka, we looked at the food journey from the farm to the market. Again, at all the transition, how the food is being processed, transported, and sold all the way to the final consumer. So again, looking at this journey of food as opposed to transportation. And in Ouagadougou, unfortunately, we couldn't go there for logistical reasons. We were, informed about the context of the urban and peri-urban and suburban development from the village to the city center. And we also developed some diagrams based on the communication with our colleague. So again, using the same methodology that we developed in Cairo based on transportation, we started to sketch out similar journey of water and food with the same idea of the urban journey or the urban narrative to demonstrate or to emphasize the spectrum as opposed to the binary understanding. And we started to develop similar diagrams. So this is the Cairo one. This is the journey of water from the source to the household, the food journey from the farm to the destination with the transportation between, and the housing and habitat development in Ouagadougou. At the end of the day, what we aim to do is to try to use a methodology that was really tested and grounded in actual data gathering in Cairo because we had more time, but develop this methodology that could potentially be extended to other cities, looking at completely different contexts and different themes, but the methodology would help us to maybe bring together these seemingly incongruent conditions into an overarching structure.
What made you decide to take this thing that was developed very specifically in Cairo and to work with those other 4 cities? Why those cities to apply this shared frame?
I mean, when AURI made the call in 2018, I think, for these separate projects, and then we presented the outcome, a draft in, I think it was Cape Town, 2018 or something. I realized out of the 12 projects, there are a few of them that has some affinity of the same question of urban informality. So it was really based on what was out there. I started talking to our colleagues in these cities and told them, what about, how you can get together and develop a project across these cities? So we didn't choose a city per se, but it was the outcome of the individual research in the multiple cities in the AURI network that in a way provoked or suggested that maybe these 4 cities would have something in common. Of course, they are not exactly aligned, and I recognize that. So it required a lot of framing and trying to put these different themes within the formal informal context. But that was basically, it was more of serendipity as opposed to methodological approach to choose the cities, at least.
One of the cities is Francophone, whereas the other ones are predominantly English speaking, although Cairo is obviously also a mix. Can you just say a few lines about the experience of trying to do this comparative research working across languages?
Yeah, I mean, that was a challenge, of course. I mean, there are a number of challenges, travel, logistics, etc. But of course, it's not just the language. I think the Francophone scholarly tradition and writing style and building an argument is not exactly like an Anglophone. So there is the linguistic challenge, but there is also how to communicate certain ideas in different thesis statement, etc., etc. There's also the regional variation. We can talk about like how cities in Africa, there's so many ways you can think of them in terms of their histories, their regions, sort of the colonial, post-colonial condition, including the language, etc. But I think to my view, the extreme difference was also enriching because we wanted to try to test this methodology across cities in its sort of extreme extent. So if we had chosen cities that are quite similar in the same region, the same colonial history, same language, maybe then it wouldn't be as possible to claim that the methodology could be extended. So
thank you, Omar. So with this, we're going to turn to Sylvia's presentation.
So as mentioned, I'll be speaking to work that we did as part of the Mistra Urban Futures network. So this particular project looked at 7 cities, 2 Swedish cities, the city of Sheffield in the UK, the cities of Kisumu in Kenya and Cape Town in South Africa. And then the 2 cities that were added was a small town in India called Shimla and a big metro, of course, capital of Argentina, Buenos Aires. And the key aims of the project were to analyze how cities are interpreting and implementing the new urban agenda, as well as the SDGs and specifically the urban-related SDGs. And then to work with cities to support the understanding and implementation of these global initiatives and facilitate cross-city learning and interaction. And then to based on this work to provide feedback to work that was happening at the global level in terms of the revisions of the targets and indicators of the urban SDGs and related initiatives. The key basis for this kind of collaborative and comparative work across these 7 cities drew on a pilot project that had already been completed in 2015. And a number of the cities, of those 7 cities, had been part of that pilot project. So I think that it's important to mention that because that provided the comparative project with already a shared basis, which built on that, the work conducted as part of that pilot project. And that pilot project looked at testing what at the time were the SDG indicators that were still being in the phase of proposal in the run-up to their adoption as part of the SDGs in 2015. And what was interesting about that particular pilot was that actually the research found across these different cities that very few or almost none of the urban SDG indicators were found to be easily, or that the data for these indicators was easily available or sometimes even relevant to the cities that were involved in that. So based on that pilot project, that was kind of the motivation for the comparative project that emerged after that. And it also fed into the aims, the guiding questions, and the methodology that was the basis for that project. So when we all started, we had one project brief. So we had shared research questions that we were all following or meant to follow across those 7 cities. And we also had a shared set of milestones and deliverables. So we had quite like a strict schedule in terms of progress reports that we had to hand in at particular moments in time. And the kind of things that we had to deliver in terms of written outputs and other publications. But looking back at the project and at the experience, I just felt that it ran quite smoothly. And I think an important component there was that we had a lead researcher. So it was one of the city researchers who worked in one of the Swedish cities, but she also was responsible for keeping track of progress and monthly meetings. So it really helped to have one key person who managed the project in a way and who made sure that we were all on track and that we had monthly meetings. And also looking back, I think one thing that worked quite well was that all the city researchers, so in each particular city, we had one person leading the work, and we were all kind of at a postdoc level. And what for me was just very, what worked quite well is that we were all kind of at the same level. And that really actually helped in our collaboration and in the work that we were doing, that we had, in a sense, we didn't have difficulties in communicating to each other. It was easy to work together because we were all kind of in the same space in terms of where we were in terms of our career. So as I mentioned, co-production was quite an important element of the work and of the method, but it actually worked on different skills and on different levels. So we had, on the one hand, co-production between ourselves as city researchers, so our team as city researchers in each particular city, and we kind of co-produced also as we went about the work. So another important component or kind of axis of co-production was between the individual city researchers in each city and the local authorities that we worked with. So in my particular case, because the African Center for Cities had already a standing agreement and a history of working together with the city of Cape Town, it allowed me to actually become embedded in the city of Cape Town for a period of 2 years, where I worked very closely within one particular department of the city on the city's approach to the SDGs. Another important component was the co-production between local authorities. So we would have annual conferences where we wouldn't just come together as city researchers, although in the first conference in Kisubi, it was just us as city researchers. But in the conferences that followed, each meeting provided also an opportunity for our respective city counterparts to join as well, and for them to have a space where they could exchange and learn together. And we had field trips as part of these meetings. And throughout the research, there were other workshops and meetings, knowledge exchanges and seminars at the city level. But we also came up with peer-to-peer or peer review exercises. So in each particular city, researchers worked in different ways with the city officials, and this allowed them to make different kind of inputs into the city's SDG approaches, plans, and policies. We ended up writing some of this up together in the form of academic articles, book chapters, and policy briefs. And because of also the focus and the aim of and the need to feed this work into the global level, over the course of the project, there were also various opportunities for people to participate in global events like the World Urban Forum, and be part of other global networks and conversations. In terms of SDG approaches and policies, we also found that we had a lot of differences in terms of the kind of tendencies or the kind of approaches to SDG implementation. So in the case of Kenya, the approach to SDG implementation has been very much top-down, where the national government decided that this is something that they want to support, and then they have created from that central level a system in which policies and orientations kind of cascade down to the lower level. Whereas, for instance, in the case of Cape Town, there was very little national government support or guidance on SDG implementation. So a lot of the work that I did with the city of Cape Town was kind of just a bottom-up endeavor. There was also a lot of difference in terms of the extent of political interest and leadership at the city level. So Sheffield for a long time was one of the cities where it was, for the researchers there, very hard to even just get the city involved, because there was absolutely no political interest or desire to lead on the SDGs. Whereas, for instance, one of the Swedish cities, Malmo, was the first city in Sweden to have adopted Agenda 2030 as a guiding principle in its work. And then also in terms of the collaborations with the city, there was quite a big range in terms of collaborations that were already quite established, such as the case of Cape Town, but also Gothenburg. But then the cities of Shimla and Buenos Aires that weren't part of the Mistra Urban Futures Network before, and where they kind of had to start from scratch in terms of setting up a collaboration with the city, which meant that they had to come up with a memorandum of understanding. But across the board, what we did see that across all the 7 cities, as we went along with the project, there was a growing awareness and also interest in the SDGs, but New Urban Agenda, it was very difficult to get traction around it. And there was very little evidence and even interest and knowledge in the implementation of the New Urban Agenda. So all of that really meant that as we went about the research, it really almost provided kind of like a microcosm of even what is happening around the SDGs in the world. And it really provided us with a testing ground for testing certain existing assumptions and exploring some of the challenges around global policy implementation. So some of the comparative learnings were around some of these existing assumptions and prerequisites. So a lot of policy think tanks and organizations have written about the need for an enabling environment for SDG implementation. So also the Local Government Association, UCLG, has developed criteria and different kind of rankings in terms of the kind of mandates that have to be in place. Then others have spoken about the need for multi-level governance mechanisms. But what we found in the work, that actually one of the deciding factor was the presence of local leaders or champions, both at the kind of technical level, so in terms of the kind of bureaucrats and city officials that we worked with, but also at a political leadership level. And you may have a perfectly enabling environment in terms of the institutional context or multi-level governance mechanisms, but without that local leadership and without the presence of these particular champions, we found that, and this was across the board in our work, that was something that actually allowed us to either not move or move forward. And then some of the shared challenges that we explored, and we published this in a joint article a few years back, was around very concrete and practical issues that cities kind of encountered as they started to engage with the SDGs. And it was really around what is the city? What are the boundaries of the city? What do we plan for? Do we plan for the functional boundaries, for the built environment? If this is an agenda that goes until 2030, do we think of the city as it is now, or do we take into account how the boundaries of the city may shift and extend over time? issues that we faced were around mandates and institutional silos, where you're talking about an agenda that is supposedly transversal and that brings different elements of sustainable development together, but you have departments within a city that are perhaps not talking to each other. So how do you break those boundaries? How do you bring people together? And this extends to actors outside of the city as well. Agenda 2030 is an agenda that talks a lot about leaving no one behind, but how do you include non-state actors in the plan, decision-making and implementation of the SDGs? How do you go about that, and how do you integrate that with existing policies and plans? And also, how do you find synergies and leverage trade-offs between not just existing local development agendas, but also the different global goals? How do we actually deal with all of these different agendas, not just the SDGs, but the new urban agenda? There's also the Sendai framework, there's the Paris Climate Agreement. And for a lot of city officials, and actually in Cape Town, when I started to work there, they were quite cynical and a bit wary also about me trying to pile on another agenda on them. So these are some of the comparative learnings and shared challenges that we were able to identify. In terms of the collaborative learnings, we really found that although in some of the cities initially there was kind of perhaps some hesitance or some resistance to engaging with the SDGs and this perception of this external global agenda that they didn't necessarily see as relevant to their own local work. But over the course of time, because there were so many different cities involved in the project, the SDGs actually allowed for a common language and entry point and into this kind of global and comparative conversation. But of course, across the different cities, there were different starting points, there were different governance systems in place, there were different speeds with which we could actually do the work. And there was also the influence of unexpected externalities, changes in local leadership, organizational restructuring. So all of this was really, there was such a changing and fluid landscape. But this is also the reality of global policy implementation. The global policies do not land on this kind of empty blank slate where nothing's happening. That if you want to talk about global policy implementation, you need to take into account that cities are very dynamic actors and landscapes. So as we went along with the work, this also required the project to shift. And whereas initially the focus was a lot around indicators and implementation, we realized that actually because of the diversity of what was happening in the 7 different cities, it was actually much more important to look at the SDGs as a process and not so much focus on implementation, but about localization. And localization is really a term that has been used and that has been advocated for by local government organizations. You cannot implement the SDGs without first bringing them down to that local level and localizing them in accordance to very specific local contexts. I eventually started working on a paper, for instance, with the colleagues in Kisumu, where we compared this difference between the kind of top-down and the bottom-up approach, and trying to put this into the perspective of the African context and issues around multi-level governance.
My question is about what are the power dynamics that end up happening when you have kind of north-south partners and big and small cities and different bureaucratic dimensions of how people work. So I'm just curious to hear in both cases how those, from a very practical research level, how those power dynamics are navigated.
How can we compare cities or neighborhoods or whatever with different sizes and different infrastructures? What do we want to find then? What kind of comparison is that? What do we want to find then?
I think you can compare the apple and orange. Everything is comparable depending on how we choose the variables, but that's a different discussion. I think there are 2 things about scale that to me are important. First, there are certain issues you can study or understand on a city scale, but not on a small scale, such as statistic trajectories, overall patterns that you can only discern when you look at the larger picture, right? So I think every scale offers different sets of questions, and I think as urbanists, we should be able to navigate different scales, being aware of the complexity and the risk of generalization. So that's number one. Number two, which is more of a normative, not analytical side, there's almost subtext of not romanticizing it, but at least finding it an answer to a lot of issues in our problem in our cities. And that's understandable because many cities in Africa, they have failed state, etc., and neoliberal turn. So one thing is important, not to limit yourself to the local scale, because yes, people are creative, resourceful, and able to find solution to the local condition, like a water tap, transportation, etc., etc. But if we limit ourselves to study the small scale, then we don't see that these are private solutions, private actors pursuing private interests. It's a very conservative mode for cities. So we still need to be able to look at the larger picture, address question of equality, of distribution of resources. Going back to the question about power relation, I think, yes, there is a lot of that. As I said, our group first joined AURI, I was struck like how North Africa is almost not acknowledged as part of Africa. And there's a lot of reasons for that, historical and linguistic, and etc. So I found our collaboration with our colleagues in Tanzania and Zambia and Wagadugu very enriching. But we had to grapple with some of these issues. There's different institutional structure, there's different governance system. But at the end of the day, if you have the team, colleagues, but also the wider community organization we collaborate with, are sensitive and open-minded, then we're able to bridge that. But these issues exist for sure, and we have to acknowledge them, and we have to deal with them.
Yeah, starting also with the issue of the power dynamics in the North-South, I do think that may have been more present in other research projects of the Mistra Urban Futures Network as a whole. I think what was quite interesting about the SDG project, because it didn't focus specifically on a particular theme, like, I don't know, like culture or sanitation, or I don't know, because it fell under the broader heading of the global agendas and of the SDGs. It meant that in each particular city, how it was eventually approached happened in different ways, and it gave cities also space to approach it in different ways. So just as an example, so in the case of Cape Town, I ended up working with the city of Cape Town in aligning the resilience strategy to the SDGs, whereas the Swedish cities used the SDGs for more issues around environmental management. The city of Shimla ended up focusing on public spaces and waste management. So I think the nice thing about having the SDGs as a global framework that framed our work, and because we had then also the method of co-production, it actually worked out differently in each city. So I feel that the power dynamics that may have perhaps been in play, or not even necessarily as part of Mistra, but other projects where sometimes the agenda can kind of be designed or imposed through the interest of the North, it was perhaps less the case in this particular project.
Today was so insightful that I'm walking away with lots of words, lots of concepts, the idea of entry points that one person put forward, courageous as scholarship as other people put forward, has been absolutely fascinating, and to then learn about different cities that you guys work in. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.